Growing the beard. This is a trope that talks about when the quality of a product goes up. Whether the writing of a TV show has been figured out, the animation of an animated series has been bumped up, or even a website that finally grows into what billions use. Every product that has been available for years always find ways to improve themselves, whether or not it brings in people or loses them. But before all this, a product starts off on a shaky start, because everything has to find a particular focus by trial and error. This is why whenever one looks over something from the beginning to end, then go back again, they'll see the changes, whether they are subtle or obvious. This is a trope called early installment weirdness. Watch your favorite show that you know by heart from the beginning and you'll see it wasn't always how you thought it was. In fact, look at yourself now and look at yourself many years ago. You will see that you are a completely different person. You may have kept some of the same characteristics all these years, but something about you has changed, whether it's personal, physical, emotional, or intellectual. No one stays the same all their lives. We all grow. Everything grows. It just takes time to find ourselves. And sometimes there's a point before we find ourselves that doesn't necessarily keep up with what we become, but it does help us find our way.
And if I say to you tomorrow.
Everyone knows who Led Zeppelin is. Everyone knows at least one song by them: Kashmir, Whole Lotta Love, Dazed and Confused, Black Dog. We all at least know the riffs from some of these songs, so much so that they have overshadowed some of their most underrated songs. But let's look at their discography as a whole. There are many who find that their first 6 albums are the best ones, while their 7th is not great, but it is a solid album, and their last one is not really discussed. But for now, let's look at where the majority of people say that the band got really good, which is their 4th album. The reason being that this album is where the band's songwriting is not only in top form, but it is the album that is the most accessible in their career, and the fact that it explores different genres, which includes a Joni Mitchell-inspired folk song, a J.R.R. Tolkien-inspired Celtic folk song, one that is a mixture of folk and progressive rock, rock with an Indian influence, and blues rock. With all these different genres presented all throughout this album, fans will present this album to anyone who wants to get into the band. The album is where the band arguably grew as musicians, which is why it is on multiple lists of greatest albums of all time. To me, that is completely understandable, because I see where their signature style came from. And it doesn't hurt that their most popular song, Stairway to Heaven, comes from this album. However, as much as I do want to agree that this album is where the band became more tight in their musicianship, I would argue on the album that came previously. When I listed the songs that people were most familiar with, one of the songs that I did not list was Immigrant Song. The reason I left it off that list is because it is the opening track to an album that, in the grand scheme of things, is the odd one out in their discography. Their 3rd album, Led Zeppelin 3, was released almost a year after Led Zeppelin 2, which is considered one of the greatest albums of all time. So you can see why that Led Zeppelin 3 is often overlooked. It is sandwiched in between 2 very well-known popular albums, and there is a good reason. Led Zeppelin has always been known for making mostly fast-paced songs that range from blues rock to progressive rock to even funk. They did have their slower moments, sure, but they didn't fully grasp about how well they could pull it off until later. Their first 2 albums are considered classic, but there is a reason as to why I think that they're only good. Their self-titled debut is a really good start to their career, and it showcased some musical chemistry. However, there is a few legal issues with a few songs. Some of the songs like Babe I'm Gonna Leave You, You Shook Me, I Can't Quit You Baby, and, to an extent, Dazed and Confused, were covers. Not many people know this because the covers were actually overshadowing the originals, to the point where I myself didn't know that Babe I'm Gonna Leave You was a cover from a song from 1962, and the song itself was written by Anne Brennan in the 1950s. Legal action was made, and eventually Brennan was given a writing credit for Zeppelin's cover. Their second album had similar problems with plagiarism to a lesser extent. Their song Whole Lotta Love had lyrics that were taken from a Muddy Waters song from 1963, which was written by Willie Dixon. The group was sued for plagiarizing and settled out of court. The Lemon Song was based on Howlin' Wolf's 1964 song Killing Floor. Arc Music, the owner of the publishing rights to Howlin' Wolf, sued Zeppelin for copyright infringement in 1972. Wolf received a check for over $40,000 from Arc, and all releases afterwards would include a co-writing credit from him. So yes, despite these albums being classic in their own rights, they have been marred by plagiarism issues. So, after they toured for the second album, they took a break at a college in Snowdonia, Wales, at the suggestion of Robert Plant. And this scenery was actually the start of something completely different for their next album. When Led Zeppelin 3 was released in 1970, it confused a great many people because it was completely different from what came before. It has a lot more acoustic guitars, and as a whole, is more of a folk rock album. Going back to the change of scenery, the cottage in Wales was the main reason as to why the album was the way it was. There was no electric power running, and that actually encouraged more acoustic emphasis, which was a contrast to the constant album touring. And the band always wanted to change their sound, and they did this by writing the majority of their material, instead of lifting from other musicians. Another change that the album had was the writing. Rather than Jimmy Page taking care of the songwriting, and although he has writing credit on most of the tracks, it was more of a group effort this time around, with Plant having a writing credit on 8 songs, John Paul Jones on 3 songs, and John Bonham on 1. This is another reason as to why the album is where the band begun to grow. The group were a lot more closer in terms of the musicianship, and on top of that, the writing added to their growth. They would make songs about love, breakups, and groupies. The writing on 3 was changed along with the music. Gallows Pole is based off of a folk song named The Maid Freed from the Gallows, and it's about an executioner being bribed not to hang certain people. Although in this version he goes ahead with the execution. Hats Off to Roy Harper is a tribute to Roy Harper, a folk rock singer whose influence has rubbed off on both Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. Bronny Yor is named after the cottage the band was staying in Wales, and some of the lyrics were inspired by Plant's dog. That's the way it's about a friendship threatened because one person is from the wrong side of town, and the family from one of the friends does not approve. And there is also an environmental message to it. And Celebration Song is a song about a corrupt society and attempting to escape its troubled times. With the changes in scenery, music, tone, and lyrics, we can see why this had a bit of a mixed reaction when it was first released. That may have been because Immigrant Song was chosen as a single, and despite it being a classic Led Zeppelin song, it, unfortunately, misrepresents the listener into what the album was. The album had a more softer approach, taking a more mellow-sounding path, and most people were not willing to give it a chance back then. But in the grand scheme of things, if it wasn't for this album, the band would not have explored areas outside of what made them popular for the first 2 albums. The album was an essential stepping stone as not just to show a band that was one note, but it showed a band that was 3-dimensional, and it explored different genres, as well as mixing some up. If it weren't for this album, their next 3 albums would sound completely different. The album may not have been successful as most of their output, but this was a moment where Led Zeppelin became Led Zeppelin, a band that ventured out of their comfort zone and kept going while retaining a sound that they refined at the beginning. It was thanks to Led Zeppelin 3 that the band knew they could do anything. Screw Flanders, 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 Screw Flanders. There, that's 30 seconds. Now the video's up to 10 minutes.